In the darkest days of World War II, as Europe burned beneath smoke and winter snow, 3 German colonels who had once commanded thousands of soldiers experienced the greatest shock of their lives not on the battlefield, but behind the barbed wire fences of American forces. Expecting hunger, beatings, and humiliation, they braced for hell. Yet when the gates closed, they found something no prisoner of war had ever imagined: warm beds, fair treatment, books, music, and even respect. And in that unlikely place, their beliefs, their loyalties, and their humanity were turned upside down. The winter of 1944 pressed down on Colonel Klaus Reinhardt like a heavy boot. He stood in what remained of a Belgian farmhouse, its roof blown open to the gray sky, and watched his regiment dissolve into chaos. Men who had marched with precision now stumbled through mud and snow, their faces hollow, their eyes empty of everything except the desperate need to survive one more hour. Klaus had been an officer for 19 years. He had studied philosophy at Heidelberg before the war, had taught military strategy, had believed in order and principle. Now those principles lay scattered across the frozen ground like the bodies of his men. Beside him, Colonel Friedrich Weber stood rigid, his jaw set in the stubborn line that Klaus had come to recognize over the past 3 years. Weber was a soldier's soldier, a man who lived by the code of honor, who believed that duty and loyalty could carry a man through any darkness. He was wrong, Klaus thought, but admired him nonetheless. The third man, Colonel Hans Adler, paced near the shattered window, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. Adler was younger, more fervent, still clinging to the propaganda that had saturated their world for 12 years. He spoke of final victory even as artillery shells whistled overhead, even as their supply lines vanished, even as the reality of defeat became undeniable. "We cannot surrender," Adler said, his voice tight. "We are officers of the Reich. We are officers of dead men," Klaus replied quietly. "Look outside, Hans. There is no Reich left to serve." Weber cleared his throat. "The men are starving. We have no ammunition, no medical supplies, no reinforcements. If we do not surrender, we condemn them all to die in this field." Adler spun toward them, his face flushed. "Better to die with honor than live as prisoners of the enemy. Do you know what the Americans will do to us? What the propaganda says they—" "The propaganda," Klaus interrupted, "has lied about everything else. Why would this be different?" But even as he spoke, fear coiled in his stomach. He had heard the stories, whispered accounts of brutality, of prisoners shot, of torture and starvation. Part of him believed they were exaggerations, products of the same machine that had fed them lies for years. Another part wondered if perhaps the truth was worse than any story. The decision came that evening. American forces surrounded their position, and a white flag rose above the ruined farmhouse. Klaus felt something break inside him as he watched it climb not his spirit, but the last thread connecting him to the man he had been when the war began. They were loaded into trucks, hands bound, flanked by American soldiers who looked impossibly young and well-fed. The journey to the coast took 3 days. 3 days of silence, of watching the devastation they had helped create scroll past the truck windows, of seeing German towns reduced to rubble, and German civilians staring at them with expressions that held no pride, no gratitude, only exhaustion, and something that looked like contempt. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, Klaus lay in the hold and listened to men weep. Weber sat stone-faced, staring at nothing. Adler muttered prayers to a god who seemed to have abandoned them all. "They will kill us," someone whispered in the darkness. "The Americans will take us to their country and execute us." Klaus said nothing. He did not know what awaited them, but he suspected it would be worse than death. It would be humiliation, degradation, the systematic destruction of whatever dignity they had left. He had prepared himself for this. He had accepted it. He was completely unprepared for what actually happened. The camp sat in the countryside of rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by rolling hills that reminded Klaus painfully of home. As the trucks rumbled through the gates, he braced himself for what he had imagined 1,000 times during the voyage: guards with clubs, barking dogs, the casual violence of victors against the vanquished. Instead, An American officer approached their formation and spoke in careful, accented German. "Gentlemen, you will be processed according to the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with the respect due to your rank. Anyone who requires medical attention should identify themselves now." Klaus exchanged glances with Weber. This had to be a trick, some cruel game before the real treatment began. They were led to a processing building where American medics waited. A young doctor, barely old enough to shave, examined Klaus with professional detachment, checking his teeth, his eyes, listening to his heart and lungs. "You have bronchitis," the doctor said through an interpreter. "We'll get you some medication. When did you last eat a full meal?" Klaus could not remember. "Weeks, perhaps months ago. We'll start you on a refeeding program," the doctor continued. "Your body needs to adjust gradually. Too much food too quickly could make you sick." He was given new clothes, not a uniform, but clean trousers and a shirt that smelled of soap. A blanket, a bar of actual soap for washing, boots that fit and had no holes. That night, in a barracks that had heat and real beds with mattresses, Klaus lay awake and tried to make sense of what was happening. Around him, men whispered in confusion and disbelief. "They gave me toothpaste," someone said. "Real toothpaste." The guard said please when they asked me to move. "This is a trap." "It must be." Weber's voice came from the next bed. "No trap. This is their way. They follow rules." "Rules," Adler scoffed from across the room. "Rules that will break when they decide we are no longer useful. Do not be fooled by their theater." But Klaus heard the uncertainty in Adler's voice. They had all been prepared for brutality. Kindness was far more disorienting. In the morning, they were served breakfast porridge with milk, bread, ersatz coffee that tasted better than anything Klaus had drunk in months. An American sergeant walked through the mess hall, stopping at their table. "Morning, colonels," he said, nodding. "Sleep okay?" The casual respect in his tone was jarring. Klaus managed a nod. "Good. After breakfast, you'll meet with the camp commander. He'll explain the protocols. If you need anything within reason, let us know." After he left, Weber leaned across the table. "They called us colonels, used our proper rank. Psychological warfare," Adler muttered. "They are softening us for interrogation." But his words carried less conviction than before. Klaus could see it in his eyes, the first small crack in the foundation of everything Adler had believed. The weeks that followed established a routine that seemed designed to systematically dismantle everything they had been taught about their enemy. The camp operated according to strict regulations. Prisoners were allowed to organize themselves, to elect representatives, to voice complaints through proper channels. They could receive letters from home, the few letters that made it through the chaos of occupied Germany. They could write back, their words carefully censored but not destroyed. Klaus found himself in the camp library one afternoon, staring at shelves of books, German literature, philosophy, history, all available for prisoners to check out and read. He pulled down a volume of Goethe and opened it with trembling hands. "Beautiful language," a voice said beside him. Klaus turned to find an American officer, a captain, standing with his own book. "I studied German literature at university," the captain continued in halting German. "Before the war, Goethe, Schiller, Heine, your culture produced magnificent things." The statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that they were more than enemies, that there was something beyond the war that connected them. "And yet, we tried to destroy yours," Klaus said quietly. The captain's expression grew somber. "Yes, but that doesn't mean we have to destroy you. A strong nation doesn't fear kindness, Colonel." That conversation haunted Klaus for days. It echoed through his mind as he observed the way guards treated prisoners firmly but fairly, with none of the casual cruelty he had witnessed in German camps. It whispered to him when the camp organized an orchestra, allowing prisoners to play music, to create beauty in the midst of captivity. Adler attended one of the concerts and left in the middle, his face twisted with something between anger and anguish. Klaus found him later, sitting alone in the barracks. "This is wrong," Adler said. "All of this is wrong, because they treat us humanely, because it destroys everything we were told." We were taught that they were monsters, subhuman, worthy only of conquest and death. But they are not monsters, Klaus. They are ordinary men who follow their laws even when it would be easier not to. What does that make us? What does that make everything we did? Klaus had no answer. He had been asking himself the same questions. The breaking point came during a medical emergency. A young prisoner, barely 20, collapsed during morning assembly. American medics rushed to help, working frantically to save his life. Klaus watched as they performed chest compressions, as they breathed air into his lungs, as they refused to give up even though this boy was their enemy. Even though letting him die would cost them nothing, they saved him. The boy lived. That night, Adler came to Klaus's bed. In the dim light, Klaus could see tears on the younger man's face. "If this is the enemy," Adler whispered, "then what were we fighting for? What did we become?" The three colonels met in secret, away from the other prisoners, struggling with questions that had no easy answers. "We were soldiers," Weber insisted. "We followed orders. That is what soldiers do." "Following orders," Klaus said, "does not absolve us of responsibility for where those orders led. You speak as if we had a choice. We always had a choice. We chose duty over conscience. We chose obedience over morality. And now we must live with those choices." Adler sat with his head in his hands. "I believed. I truly believed we were building something better, something pure. I looked at the propaganda and I saw truth. How could I have been so blind?" "Because you wanted to believe," Klaus said gently. "We all did. It is easier to follow a certainty than to live with doubt." They were interrupted by a knock. A young American lieutenant stood at the door. "Colonel Reinhardt? There's someone here to see you." Klaus followed him to a small office where a German prisoner sat waiting, a private, no more than 19, with bandages on his hands and a haunted expression that Klaus recognized. He had seen it in mirrors. "The boy asked to speak with you specifically," the lieutenant said. "I'll give you privacy." After he left, the young soldier spoke in a rush. "Sir, I need to tell someone. I need to confess. The things we did in Poland, in Russia, the things I saw, the things I was ordered to do, I have carried them alone for so long, and I cannot anymore. I cannot." Klaus listened as the boy spoke of atrocities, of villages burned, of civilians murdered, of horrors committed in the name of ideology and racial purity. Some of it Klaus had suspected. Much of it he had deliberately avoided knowing, had turned away from, had chosen not to see. When the boy finished, he wept. Klaus put a hand on his shoulder and felt the weight of complicity settle more heavily on his own soul. "We cannot change what was done," Klaus said finally. "But we can choose what we do now. We can choose to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that the truth is not buried beneath convenient lies." That evening, Klaus began writing. He wrote about the war, about the things he had seen and done, about the transformation happening within these barbed wire fences. He wrote as an act of penance and an act of hope, recording not for glory but for truth. Weber found him hunched over the paper. "What are you writing?" "History," Klaus said, "before it can be rewritten. Before we can lie to ourselves about what happened here. Here in the camp, here in the world, here in our souls." In accordance with the Geneva Convention, prisoners were allowed to work for wages. It was voluntary, but most signed up anything to break the monotony, to feel useful again. Klaus found himself assigned to a farm work detail along with Weber and a dozen other prisoners. They rode in trucks to nearby farms where they would harvest crops, repair fences, help with whatever tasks the farmers needed. The first time an American farmer handed Klaus a tool and said, "Thank you," for his work, Klaus nearly dropped it in shock. The simple courtesy, the basic human acknowledgement, felt more radical than any political philosophy he had studied. They worked in fields of corn and wheat, under a summer sun that was nothing like the brutal heat of North Africa or the freezing hell of the Eastern Front. The work was hard but honest. At midday, the farmer's wife brought them water and sandwiches, setting the food down without fear or hatred. Just a tired woman feeding tired men. Weber wiped sweat from his brow and looked around at the fertile land, the peaceful countryside, the simple abundance of this place. Paradise, he murmured. We never had this at home. Klaus understood what he meant. Even before the war, even in the prosperous years, there had been a hunger in Germany not always for food, but for something else, a desperate grasping for glory, for dominance, for proof of superiority. These American farmers did not seem to need any of that. They worked their land, raised their families, lived their lives without the fevered intensity that had consumed an entire nation. One afternoon, as they loaded hay onto a wagon, one of the horses spooked and reared. A prisoner jumped back, slipped, fell directly in the path of thrashing hooves. An American guard threw himself forward, shoving the prisoner clear, taking a glancing blow to his shoulder that left him grimacing in pain. The guard sat up, rubbing his arm, and grinned at the shaken prisoner. You okay? The prisoner nodded, speechless. Good. Let's get back to work. That night, the prisoners talked about nothing else. A guard had risked injury to save one of them. The enemy had valued their life above his own safety. This changes nothing, one prisoner insisted. An older sergeant who still wore his ideological certainty like armor. They are still the enemy. This is still captivity. But his words fell flat. Too many of them had seen too much that contradicted the narrative they had been fed for years. Adler pulled Klaus aside after dinner. Do you remember what they told us in training? That the Americans were soft, weak, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing, that they would collapse at the first sign of real conflict. I remember. We were told that strength came from purity, from iron discipline, from the willingness to be ruthless. But look at them, Klaus. They are not weak, they are not soft. They defeated us while maintaining their humanity. What does that say about our definition of strength? Klaus had no answer that would comfort either of them. The interaction with civilians increased as the months passed. Farmers who employed them, shopkeepers in nearby towns, families who lived around the camps all seemed to regard the prisoners with curiosity more than hatred. One Saturday, a farmer named Thompson invited the work detail to his house for lunch. His wife had prepared food, and their 3 children stared at the German prisoners with wide eyes. Don't be rude, Sarah, Mrs. Thompson chided her youngest daughter, who was perhaps 8 years old. But Sarah approached Klaus anyway, holding a handful of wildflowers she had picked. Mama said you're not bad men, she said, offering him the flowers. Just men who got lost. Klaus took the flowers with hands that shook. He looked at this child who should hate him, who would have been taught to hate him, but who offered kindness instead. Thank you, he managed. Your mother is very wise. That simple gesture, a child's flowers, did more to break Klaus than any interrogation could have achieved. He carried those flowers back to camp and pressed them between the pages of his journal, preserving them like evidence of something he could barely believe. Weber watched this interaction and later confessed, I have killed men who looked like Thompson. I have given orders that destroyed families like his, and yet he feeds us from his table, and his daughter gives us flowers. How do we make sense of this? Perhaps we are not meant to make sense of it, Klaus replied. Perhaps we are only meant to witness it and be changed by it. Adler struggled most visibly with these encounters. His entire worldview had been built on the premise of clear enemies and righteous cause. Every act of American kindness, every moment of ordinary human decency, chipped away at that foundation. One evening, he exploded. Stop being kind to us. We do not deserve it. We are your enemies. We tried to destroy everything you believe in. Why do you not hate us? An American sergeant who overheard looked at him with something like pity. Son, I do hate what you did. I hate what your country became. But hating you, hating every individual German soldier, what would that accomplish? Would it bring back the dead? Would it undo the evil that was done? All it would do is make me into something I don't want to be. The sergeant walked away, leaving Adler standing in the yard with tears streaming down his face. News from Europe came in fragments, reports in newspapers, letters from home, whispered accounts from new prisoners arriving. Berlin had fallen. The full extent of the concentration camps had been revealed. Germany lay in ruins, occupied and divided. The prisoners gathered around radios to hear the news, and Klaus watched their faces transform as they learned the truth about what had been done in their name. Some refused to believe it. Some broke down completely. Many, like Klaus himself, felt a crushing weight of guilt and shame that no punishment could adequately address. Adler did not emerge from his bunk for 3 days. When he finally did, he looked like he had aged a decade. 6 million, he said to Klaus. Jews. 6 million murdered. And I believed it was right. I believed they were the enemy, that we were cleansing the world of corruption. Oh God, Klaus, what have we done? Klaus had no comfort to offer. He had his own reckoning to face, his own guilt to carry. An American officer, Major Harrison, found Klaus in the library one afternoon. Harrison had fought in Europe, had seen the camps firsthand. I want to hate you, Harrison said quietly. When I saw what was in those camps, when I saw the ovens and the mass graves, I wanted to hate every German soldier, every officer, everyone who wore that uniform. Klaus waited, braced for condemnation he knew he deserved. But then I met men like you, Harrison continued. Men who are trying to understand what happened, who are facing what they were part of, even though it would be easier to deny it. And I realized that hate is a luxury I cannot afford. If I hate you, if I dehumanize you the way your country dehumanized others, then I become part of the cycle. The evil continues. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You cannot undo what was done, Colonel. None of us can. But you can choose what you do with the rest of your life. You can choose to remember, to speak truth, to rebuild something better. That is the only redemption available to any of us. That night, Klaus wrote in his journal, we came here expecting punishment and found mercy. We expected hatred and found humanity. And in that unexpected grace, we have been forced to confront the monster we became. Perhaps this is the harshest punishment of all, to be shown what we could have been if we had chosen differently. The announcement came in the spring of 1946. The war had been over for nearly a year. Prisoners were being repatriated, sent back to a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. The reaction in the camp was complex. Some prisoners celebrated, eager to return home. Others fell silent, knowing what awaited them: a destroyed country, families they might never find, a future built on ashes. Klaus walked the campgrounds one last time, memorizing the place that had become stranger than home. He found Weber standing by the fence, staring at the Pennsylvania hills. I do not want to leave, Weber admitted. Is that treason? Is it cowardice? I do not want to return to that devastation, to face what we helped create. It is human, Klaus said. But we must go back. We must help rebuild. We must ensure that the truth of what happened is not forgotten or distorted. The final days in camp were surreal. American guards who had watched over them for months shook their hands, wished them well. Some gave them small gifts, photographs, addresses, promises to write. On the last evening, the camp commander gathered all the prisoners in the assembly hall. Gentlemen, he said, you came here as enemies of my country. You leave as men we have lived alongside for months or years. I cannot speak for what you did in the war. I cannot absolve you of that. But I can tell you that you have conducted yourselves with dignity during your time here. You have followed our rules, worked hard, and treated our people with respect. I hope you will take that spirit back with you and help build a better Germany. After he finished, Weber stood and spoke in English he had learned during captivity. Sir, we came here expecting hell. We found something we had no word for. You showed us that strength and kindness are not opposites, that humanity and discipline can coexist. If this is captivity, then America is paradise. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, Americans and Germans alike began to applaud. That night, Klaus could not sleep. He packed his few belongings, his journal, the pressed flowers from Sarah Thompson, a photograph taken with some of the guards, tokens of a transformation he still struggled to fully comprehend. The The ship crossing back to Europe felt like a journey through time in reverse. Klaus stood at the rail and watched America disappear over the horizon, carrying with it the strange interlude of peace and plenty they had experienced. When they disembarked at Bremerhaven, the devastation was overwhelming. The Germany they returned to was unrecognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced or dead. The proud nation that had marched to war now begged for food from the very enemies it had tried to annihilate. Klaus, Weber, and Adler stayed together, making their way through the chaos to find what remained of their homes and families. Weber discovered his house still standing but empty. His wife had taken their children and fled east, and he had no way of knowing if they were alive. Adler found his entire neighborhood erased, replaced by a crater that still smelled of smoke. Klaus learned that his sister had survived, but his parents had not. They met again 3 months later in Munich, gaunt and exhausted, trying to navigate a world where nothing made sense anymore. "I tried to tell them," Adler said. "I tried to explain what we experienced in America, how we were treated. They accused me of being a traitor, of sympathizing with the enemy. They said I had been brainwashed. They are not ready to hear it," Weber replied. "They are too busy surviving to think about meaning. Perhaps they never will be ready." But Klaus disagreed. "We must keep telling the story. We must bear witness to what we learned. If not for this generation, then for the next. Someone must remember that even in the darkest time, humanity persisted, that our enemies showed us more grace than we showed ourselves." Klaus found work teaching at a school that was reopening. He taught history, but not the mythology they had been fed. He taught the truth, complicated, painful, necessary truth. He taught students that strength comes not from dominance but from justice, not from purity but from compassion. Weber joined the reconstruction efforts, helping to rebuild infrastructure and institutions. He applied the principles he had observed in American governance: transparency, accountability, the rule of law applied equally. It was slow work, frustrating work, but he persisted. Adler struggled most with the transition. The collapse of his belief system had left him unmoored, but gradually, painfully, he began to build a new foundation, one based not on ideology but on human dignity, not on certainty but on questions. One evening, the three of them sat in the ruins of a beer hall that had once been grand and spoke of the future. "Do you think we will ever be forgiven?" Adler asked. Klaus considered the question carefully. "I do not think forgiveness is ours to claim. We can only do the work of remembering, of teaching, of ensuring it never happens again. Whether that earns forgiveness is not for us to decide. The Americans forgave us," Weber pointed out. "In their way, they could have treated us with the brutality we deserved. Instead, they showed us another path. Then perhaps," Klaus said, "our responsibility is to honor that gift by becoming worthy of it, to build a Germany that deserves the mercy we were shown." 20 years passed. Germany rebuilt itself slowly, painfully, through economic miracle and cultural reckoning. Klaus, Weber, and Adler remained in contact, meeting annually on the anniversary of their release from the Pennsylvania camp. In 1966, they sat together in a cafe in Frankfurt and decided it was time to write down their story, not as an excuse or a justification, but as a testament to the complexity of war, to the power of humane treatment, even of enemies, to the possibility of transformation. The memoir took 3 years to write. They argued about details, struggled with how to present certain truths, debated what lessons could be drawn from their experience, but they were united in their central purpose: to bear witness. When the book was published, the reaction was mixed. Some Germans accused them of being apologists for the Allied occupation. Some Americans thought they were trying to minimize German guilt. But many readers understood what they were trying to say, that even in the midst of the greatest war in history, humanity could persist, and that persistence mattered. One day, Klaus received a letter from Pennsylvania. It was from Sarah Thompson, the little girl who had given him flowers 30 years before. She was now a teacher herself, using their memoir in her history classes. "Thank you for telling the truth," she wrote. Thank you for showing my students that people can change, that enemies can recognize each other's humanity, that even the darkest chapters can contain moments of light. Klaus wept when he read those words, not from sadness, but from a kind of gratitude that had no adequate expression. The three colonels made one more journey together. In 1970, they traveled back to America, to Pennsylvania, to the camp that had been their prison and their salvation. It had been converted to other uses, but the bones of it remained the buildings, the fences, the grounds where they had worked and walked and slowly transformed. They were met by some of their former guards, old men now, who embraced them as friends, by farmers they had worked for, who remembered them clearly, by children and grandchildren who had heard stories and wanted to meet these men, who had crossed from enemy to human and back again. At a ceremony in the nearby town, the mayor presented them with a plaque that read, "In recognition of the power of humane treatment to transform enmity into understanding, hatred into healing, and war into peace." Weber gave the speech, his English now fluent. "We came to your country as prisoners of war," he said. "We expected punishment. We received kindness. We expected humiliation. We received respect. And in that unexpected grace, we were forced to confront everything we had believed, everything we had fought for, everything we had become." He paused, looking out at the crowd of Americans and Germans gathered together. "You did not have to show us mercy. You would have been justified in your hatred, but you chose a different path. You chose to see us not as monsters to be destroyed, but as men who could be redeemed. And in doing so, you gave us the chance to become something better than we had been." Klaus added his own words. "Between hatred and humanity, America chose humanity, and that choice changed us forever. It taught us that true strength lies not in dominance but in restraint, not in vengeance but in justice, not in dehumanizing others but in maintaining one's own humanity even in the face of evil." Adler, who had once been the most fervent believer in Nazi ideology, spoke last. "I spent the first half of my life believing in a lie. I believed in racial superiority, in the necessity of conquest, in the glory of war. I believed these things with absolute certainty, but your kindness, your unexpected, undeserved kindness destroyed that certainty. And from that destruction, something truer could grow." After the ceremony, they walked the grounds of the old camp one more time. Klaus found the spot where the library had been, where an American captain had talked to him about Goethe. Weber stood where the barracks had housed them, where they had first experienced the shock of humane treatment. Adler paused at what had been the assembly ground, where his faith had finally shattered and something better had begun to form. That evening, sitting together in a hotel room, they toasted to the memory of all who had died in the war, German and American, soldier and civilian, the guilty and the innocent. "We cannot bring them back," Klaus said. "We cannot undo the evil that was done. But we can remember. We can tell the truth. We can insist that future generations understand both the depths to which humanity can sink and the heights to which it can rise. Even in a prison camp," Weber added. "Especially in a prison camp," Adler finished. They sat in silence for a time. Three old men who had traveled an impossible journey from hatred to understanding, from certainty to wisdom, from enemy to witness. Klaus thought of the flowers Sarah had given him, still pressed in his journal after all these years. He thought of the American sergeant who had saved a prisoner from a horse's hooves. He thought of farmers who had fed them, guards who had called them by their rank, medics who had healed them when they could have let them die. And he thought of the choice America had made not to be soft, not to be weak, but to be strong enough to remain human even in the face of inhumanity, to be powerful enough to show mercy to those who had deserved none. That choice, Klaus realized, was the real victory. Not the military triumph, not the economic dominance, but the moral courage to treat enemies as human beings capable of change. That was the paradise they had found, not a place of physical comfort, though there had been that too, but a place where dignity was preserved and transformation was possible. "Paradise on earth," Weber murmured, as if reading Klaus's thoughts. Not because it was easy or pleasant, but because it showed us what we could become if we chose differently. The three men sat together as darkness fell, guardians of a memory that mattered more with each passing year. In a world that seemed always on the edge of forgetting, they would remember. They would bear witness. They would tell the story of how kindness in a prison camp changed three colonels from Germany, and through them, perhaps changed the world just a little bit. For in the end, Klaus thought, that was all any of them could do: hold on to the truth, speak it clearly, and trust that somewhere, someone would hear and understand. That enemies could become friends. That hatred could transform into healing. That even from the ashes of the worst war in history, something better could grow. They had seen it happen. They were living proof. And until their final days, they would carry that testimony forward, a reminder that between the darkness of what humans can do to each other and the light of what humans can be for each other, there is always a choice. America had made its choice, and in making it, had given three German colonels the chance to make theirs. That was the paradise they found, and they would never forget it.